The afternoon sun slanted through the windows of St. Mary's Home for the Aged, painting golden bars across the worn wooden floor. Reverend Isaiah Moss sat in his rocking chair, 92 years weathered into his frame like rings in ancient timber. His hands, gnarled as old roots, rested on a leather journal so worn the cover had gone soft as skin. Across from him sat his grandson, Daniel, 25 and fresh from the university, notebook open and pencil ready. The young man had come seeking stories of the Old West for the newspaper, expecting tales of outlaws and shootouts. What he would hear instead was something far more profound. "Grandfather," Daniel said, "they say you knew all the legends. Wild Bill, the Earp brothers, Geronimo himself." Moss smiled, a distant look crossing his pale blue eyes. "I knew men greater than legends, boy. I knew men who chose honor when it cost them everything. I knew a man named Nathaniel Blackwood, and if you've got the patience, I'll tell you about the finest soul I ever met." The old reverend's voice took on a storyteller's cadence, and the room seemed to fall away. It was 1878, and the world was harder then. Not just the land or the weather, but the hearts of men. In a place called Copper Ridge, in the shadow of the Chiricahua Mountains, they kept a woman in a cage, and the whole town walked past like it was nothing at all. His eyes closed, remembering. That's where our story begins. Copper Ridge, Arizona Territory, September 1878. The town sat in a shallow basin where Copper Creek wound between hills covered in scrub and stone. Main Street stretched a quarter-mile of rutted dirt, flanked by weathered buildings that leaned like tired old men. At the south end stood the cantina, its faded paint the color of dried blood. The general store squatted next to it, dark and quiet. The blacksmith's forge sent up thin smoke that barely rose in the still air. The church, such as it was, listed slightly to the east, its steeple pointing at heaven, but missing by a few degrees. And in the town square, under the cottonwood tree, stood the cage, 8 feet by 8 feet, constructed of iron bars salvaged from the abandoned mine that had given the town its name. Barely tall enough for a person to stand. No shelter from sun or rain or the cold that came down from the mountains at night. Inside sat a woman. She had been there 7 months. The townspeople had stopped noticing her the way you stop noticing a fence post or a hitching rail. Children dared each other to poke sticks between the bars until their mothers called them away. On Saturday nights, when the miners came in with money and whiskey courage, men placed bets on how long she would last. Some said she'd die before winter. Others said she was too mean to die, that she'd outlast them all out of pure spite. Her name, if anyone had bothered to ask, was Ayanna White Deer. She was 26 years old. Her skin was the color of aged copper. Her hair black and matted, falling past her shoulders in tangles. What remained of her dress had once been doeskin, worked soft by patient hands, but now it was little more than rags. She was thin, half-starved, marked with scars on her arms and back that spoke of cruelties no human being should endure. But it was her eyes that people remembered. Even caged, even broken by whatever horrors had brought her to this place, there was something in those eyes. A kind of witnessing, a refusal to look away or look down. Green-brown, like moss on river stones, holding on to something the iron bars could not touch. The sun was climbing toward noon when Nathaniel Blackwood rode into Copper Ridge. He came down from the high country leading a pack mule and riding a gray horse that had seen as many years and hard miles as its owner. Nate was 58 years old, though the mountains had aged him in ways that had nothing to do with time. He stood 6 feet 2 inches in his moccasins, lean as a winter-stripped pine, all sinew and quiet strength. His hair was dark shot through with silver, hanging past his collar and tied back with a leather cord. His beard, more gray than brown now, covered the lower half of his face and couldn't quite hide the scar that ran from his left temple down to his jaw. A Comanche lance had put it there 22 years ago, and the memory of that day still woke him sometimes in the deep hours before dawn. He wore buckskins he'd worked himself, a wolfskin coat despite the heat, and he carried a Spencer rifle across his saddle with the easy familiarity of a man who'd needed it more times than he cared to count. His eyes were pale blue, the color of ice on high mountain lakes, and they missed very little. Beside him, on a smaller horse, rode his nephew Tommy. The boy was 16, gangly in that way of young men still growing into their frames, with his uncle's dark hair and a face that hadn't yet learned how to hide what he was thinking. Nate had been raising him for 2 years now, since Tommy's mother had died of consumption and left the boy with nowhere else to go. They rode in silence, as was their way. Nate had never been one for unnecessary words, and Tommy was learning that lesson well. But when they reached the town square, Nate stopped his horse. He sat there for a long moment, looking at the way and the woman inside. Ayanna looked back. Their eyes met and held. Hers held no pleading, no begging, just that steady witnessing, as if she were memorizing his face for some future reckoning. Tommy shifted in his saddle, uncomfortable. Uncle Nate, why would they do that? That's a person, not an animal. Nate's jaw tightened beneath his beard. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried weight like stone settling. Men do terrible things, Tommy, when they forget what it means to be human. Something in the woman's face shifted, just the slightest narrowing of her eyes, as if she understood his words even from 30 feet away. From the cantina doorway, a woman emerged. She was in her late 40s, handsome rather than pretty, with dark hair pulled back, severe, and eyes that had seen enough of life's cruelties to judge them less harshly than most. Carlota Martinez, called Lottie by everyone, ran the cantina with a firm hand and a sharp eye for human nature. She carried a cup of water and a piece of cornbread wrapped in cloth. She walked to the cage without looking around, as she did every day, and pushed them through the bars. The caged woman took them without acknowledgement, without gratitude, because both of them understood that mercy offered by witnesses to cruelty was complicated at best. Lottie turned and saw Nate watching. Recognition flickered across her face. Nate Blackwood. Been a long time. 6 months, maybe more. Nate touched the brim of his hat. Lottie, the boy's grown some. She looked at Tommy and smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. He has. Got his uncle's look about him. Her gaze drifted back to the cage. You wondering about her? I'm wondering how long this has been allowed. 7 months. Sheriff Dutch bought her off some skin traders passing through, paid $25, and figured he could make it back 10 times over through entertainment. The word dripped with disgust. Tommy couldn't stay quiet. Entertainment? That's evil. Lottie's expression softened. Yes, boy, it is. But evil's been normalized here. When good people do nothing, evil just becomes the way things are. Nate studied the woman in the cage. Something about her bearing, even broken down as she was, spoke of education, of a life that had once held dignity. You know who she is? Lottie glanced around, dropped her voice. There's talk. Some say she's Judge Alvarez's daughter, but nobody dares say it loud. The judge was asking the wrong questions before his family got killed. Copper Baron Mining didn't appreciate the attention. Nate's entire body went still. Miguel Alvarez? You knew him? The question hung in the air between them. Nate's mind had gone elsewhere, to a campfire in 1856, to a cavalry lieutenant with kind eyes and a fierce sense of justice, to a promise made 22 years ago that Nate had thought he'd never have to keep. We fought together once, Nate said finally. He saved my life. I told him if anything ever happened to him, I'd look after his family. Lottie's eyebrows rose. That was a long time ago to remember a promise. A promise doesn't have an expiration date. Nate swung down from his horse, his movements deliberate. Where's the sheriff? His office. But Nate, you can't just go in there and demand he free her. Dutch is on the company payroll. He won't give her up for nothing. Nate handed his reins to Tommy. Everything has a price. Stay here. He walked across the square toward the sheriff's office, his boots raising small clouds of dust with each step. Tommy watched him go, then looked at the woman in the cage. She was watching too, her expression unreadable. The sheriff's office was dim and smelled of old tobacco and older sweat. Sheriff Clayton Dutch sat behind a desk, scattered with wanted posters and playing cards, his boots up on the wood, a half-empty bottle at his elbow. He was in his mid-40s, running to fat, with a handlebar mustache he waxed with pride, and small eyes that calculated profit in every situation. 2 deputies lounged against the back wall, both young and mean-looking, in that particular way of men who'd been given a little power and no moral framework for using it. Dutch looked up when Nate entered, and something like calculation crossed his face. Well now, Nate Blackwood, Thought maybe you died up in those mountains. Not yet. Nate stood in the middle of the room, making no move toward the chair. I want to buy the woman in the cage. The deputy straightened. Dutch's feet came off the desk slowly. That's so. Didn't figure you for that type, Blackwood. What type I am isn't your concern. Name your price. Dutch leaned back, studying Nate like a poker hand. She's worth a fair bit. Entertainment value, you understand. Hard to replace. I'm thinking $200. It was an outrageous sum, enough to buy a good horse and saddle with money left over. Dutch was testing, seeing how badly Nate wanted this. Nate reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch. He counted out $200 in gold coins, placing them on the desk one at a time. Each coin made a small sound as it landed, final as a judge's gavel. The silence stretched. Dutch stared at the money, his face going through calculations. Finally, he shrugged. Your funeral, Blackwood, she's half savage anyway. Probably gut you in your sleep. The papers. Dutch scrawled out a bill of sale, his handwriting crude and barely legible. He pushed it across the desk along with a key. She's all yours. Don't come crying to me when she causes trouble. Nate took both without comment and walked back out into the sunlight. A small crowd had gathered in the square. Word traveled fast in a town this size, and the sight of Nate Blackwood buying the caged woman was too interesting to miss. People whispered behind their hands, some laughing, some shaking their heads. One old miner called out, "She'll knife you before you get to the mountains, Blackwood." Nate ignored them all. He walked to the cage and held up the key so the woman inside could see it. Then he stepped forward and unlocked the door. The woman didn't move at first. 7 months in a cage teaches you that nothing comes without a price, that every gesture of kindness is a prelude to something worse. Nate stepped back, giving her space. I knew your father, he said in Spanish, then repeated it in halting Apache, the words rough but sincere. Miguel Alvarez, I'm here to honor a promise. Her eyes widened slightly. It was the first emotion he'd seen cross her face. She stood slowly, her legs trembling from disuse. When she reached her full height, she was perhaps 5.5 feet tall, but the way she held herself made her seem larger. She looked at Nate, then at Tommy, then at the gathered crowd with an expression that could have curdled milk. Nate took off his wolfskin coat and held it out. For the ride, gets cold in the mountains. She stared at the coat for a long moment, then moving like someone who'd forgotten what kindness looked like, she took it and wrapped it around her shoulders. Nate walked to his horse and mounted. He held out his hand. The woman looked at that hand, at the faces of the townspeople gathered around, at Sheriff Dutch watching from his doorway with a smirk. Then she took Nate's hand, and he pulled her up behind Tommy with strength that belied his lean frame. As they rode out of Copper Ridge, heading toward the mountains that rose purple and dark in the distance, the townspeople began to laugh and make their predictions. She'd knife him before they reached his cabin. She'd run off into the wilderness and die of exposure. She'd prove more trouble than any woman was worth, savage or civilized. Only Lottie Martinez, watching from her cantina doorway, wondered if maybe, just maybe, they were all wrong. There was something in the way that mountain man had looked at the woman in the cage, not with desire or possession, but with something simpler and rarer. Recognition. The recognition of one human being seeing another and deciding that was enough. The sun was lowering toward the western peaks as Nathaniel Blackwood, his nephew Tommy, and the woman with no voice disappeared into the tree line, heading up into country where the air grew thin and the only laws were the ones a man carried in his own heart. The journey into the Chiricahua Mountains took the better part of 4 hours, following a trail that grew fainter with each mile until it was nothing more than a thread of disturbed earth, winding between towering pines. The woman sat rigid behind Tommy on the horse, her hands gripping the saddle rather than the boy, maintaining as much distance as the arrangement allowed. She said nothing. Nate didn't press. He'd learned long ago that silence was its own kind of language, and this woman had reasons beyond counting to trust nothing and no one. The air grew cooler as they climbed, carrying the clean scent of pine resin and the mineral smell of stone. A hawk circled overhead, riding thermals invisible to the eye. Somewhere in the distance, an elk bugled, the lonely, haunting call echoing across the valleys. The woman flinched at the sound, her whole body tensing. Nate felt it through the saddle. Just an elk, he said quietly, bull calling for his herd. They do that this time of year. She didn't respond, but some of the tension eased from her frame. Tommy, being 16 and unable to stay quiet forever, ventured a question. Uncle Nate, how did you know her father? Nate was quiet for a long stretch, the only sound the steady clop of hooves on stone and the creak of leather. Finally he spoke. Fort Defiance, 1856. I was scouting for the cavalry. Miguel Alvarez was a lieutenant back then before he became a judge. We got caught by a Comanche raiding party. 20 of them, 3 of us. Miguel could have saved himself, but he came back. Took a lance meant for me. Nate touched the scar on his face unconsciously. This is from the same fight. We made it out, barely. That night, around the fire, he asked me to make a promise. What promise? That if anything ever happened to him, I'd look after his family. He had a wife and a little girl back then. Said he had a feeling the work he was doing would make him enemies. Nate's voice went distant. I promised. A man's only as good as his word, Tommy. Remember that. Behind them, though they couldn't see it, the woman's eyes filled with tears. It was the first time she'd cried in 9 years. The cabin sat in a clearing carved from the forest by a long-ago fire, now regrown with young pine around the edges. Whitewater Creek ran nearby, the headwaters of the same Copper Creek that gave the town its name, though up here it was clear and cold and full of trout. The cabin itself was solid work, built from logs Nate had cut and notched himself, with a stone chimney that drew clean and a roof that had weathered 12 winters without leaking. There was a small barn for the horse and shum, a shed for stores and pelts, and a quiet that settled over everything like fresh snow. Nate dismounted and offered his hand to help the woman down. She ignored it, sliding off the horse on her own, stumbling slightly when her feet hit the ground. Her legs had been confined too long. She caught herself against the horse's flank, steadied, and looked around with the wariness of a creature that had learned to map every escape route before anything else. Cabin's there, Nate said, nodding toward the structure. You can sleep inside or out. Your choice. There's a creek just past those trees if you want to wash. I'll see to the animals and get a fire going. She stared at him, those remarkable eyes searching his face for the trap, the angle, the moment when mercy would reveal itself as just another form of cruelty. When she spoke, her voice was hoarse from disuse, shaped by an accent that carried traces of languages older than English. Why not me? Just that one word, but it contained multitudes. Why buy me? Why bring me here? Why speak as if I have choices? Why pretend kindness? Nate met her gaze steadily. Because no living creature should be caged like that. Because I had the money and you needed out. That's all. Nothing is ever all, she said, and there was a lifetime of bitter knowledge in those words. Fair enough, Nate acknowledged. Then add this, I got no expectations beyond you being here until you figure out what you want to do next. You're free to leave whenever you choose. I won't stop you, won't follow you, won't claim any rights over you, despite what that paper says. But if you stay as a free woman. Clear? She studied him for a long moment, then turned and walked toward the creek without another word, still wrapped in his coat. Tommy watched her go, then looked at his uncle. You think she'll run? Maybe, maybe not. Either way, it's her choice to make. But Nate began unsaddling the horses. Tommy, lesson for today. Respecting someone's freedom sometimes means accepting they might use it to leave. Real strength isn't about control, it's about trust. They worked in silence after that, settling the animals, stacking the furs in the shed. Nate built a fire in the cabin's hearth and set water to boil, made a simple stew from dried venison and root vegetables, put coffee on to brew. As darkness fell and the temperature dropped, he heard her moving around outside. He left the cabin door open, positioned a lantern just inside so its light spilled out in welcome without forcing her to step into its source. He ate his portion of stew, left the pot hanging over the fire to stay warm, and settled into his chair with the worn journal he kept for observations. Hours passed. The fire burned down to coals. Outside, he heard her gathering wood, the small sounds of someone trying to move quietly but unpracticed in these particular woods. Eventually, he banked the fire and stretched out on his bed. Through the open door, he could see the small fire she'd built for herself at the edge of the clearing, could see her silhouette sitting beside it, wrapped in his coat and a blanket she must have taken from the barn. She was watching the cabin, watching him, waiting for whatever came next. Nate closed his eyes and let sleep take him, trusting that tomorrow would unfold as it needed to. He woke to bird song and pale dawn light. The woman was gone from the fireside, and for a moment, he wondered if she'd run after all. Then he heard movement from the barn and relaxed. She was checking on the animals, or perhaps just seeking shelter that felt safer than the cabin. He rose, stoked the fire back to life, made coffee and cornmeal mush with honey. When she appeared in the doorway, moving along the wall to keep maximum distance between them, he gestured to the pot. "There's food if you want it. Coffee, too." She came inside for the first time, her eyes cataloging everything. The rifle above the door, the knives on the table, the windows, the layout, survival calculations made automatic by necessity. Nate poured coffee into a tin cup, set it on the table with a bowl of mush and a spoon, then took his own breakfast outside to sit on the stump he used for splitting wood, giving her space, letting her eat without being watched. When she emerged, the cup and bowl were empty. She set them on the bench by the door and looked at him across the clearing. "I'm called Ayana," she said, and the name came out like something precious Surit she was testing, seeing if it would hold up in the air between them or shatter like the fragile thing it had become. "Ayana White Deer." Nate stood, wiping his hands on his buckskins. "Nathaniel Blackwood. Most call me Nate. This is my nephew, Tommy." Tommy, who'd been watching from the barn doorway, stepped forward and touched his hat brim. "Ma'am?" Something shifted in Ayana's face. Not quite a smile, but a loosening of the hard set of her mouth, as if hearing her name spoken with respect was water to parched earth. The days that followed fell into a careful rhythm. Ayana slept in the barn at first. Then, after a week in the cabin, pressed against the far wall and wrapped in blankets Nate had given her. She was healing physically. The wounds on her arms and back scabbed over, the hollows in her cheeks filling out from regular meals. But the deeper wounds would take longer. She began to help without being asked, fetching water from the creek, gathering firewood, watching how Nate and Tommy prepared food, then taking over some of those tasks. They communicated mostly through gesture and demonstration. Nate would show her how to bank a fire for overnight, how to tell when the coffee was ready, how to read weather in the sky. Ayana proved quick to learn and quicker to remember. On the fourth day, she made something from her childhood. Mesquite bean cakes, worked from ingredients Nate had on hand, prepared the way her mother had taught her when she was small, and the world made sense. Tommy ate 3 of them. "These are better than anything Uncle Nate makes." Nate smiled, just a slight quirk at the corner of his mouth, but it was real. Ayana saw it and felt something unknot in her chest. This man who'd bought her freedom, who asked nothing in return, who gave her space and respect and simple human dignity, was capable of joy, however small, however fleeting. On the 10th day, Sheriff Dutch came to call. He arrived with 2 men from the Copper Baron Mining Company, hired guns by the look of them, hard-eyed and comfortable with the revolvers at their hips. Ayana was inside the cabin when she heard the horses. She appeared in the doorway, her whole body coiled with the tension of a trapped animal, hearing the hunters approach. Dutch sat his horse in the clearing, making no move to dismount, a calculated show of authority. "Morning, Blackwood. Thought I'd ride out, check on how you're managing with your purchase." Nate set down the axe he'd been using to split wood. "Managing fine, appreciate the concern." "See, that's the thing." Dutch smiled that oily smile of his. "I've had some complaints from concerned citizens. Questions about propriety, about whether a civilized man ought to be keeping an Apache woman out here without proper documentation, without the oversight of Christian values." Ayana stepped forward, and when she spoke, her English was clear and cold. "I'm not just Apache. I'm half Mescalero Apache and half Spanish, and I'm not being kept. I'm here by choice." Dutch's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "Well, now she speaks. That's something. But the law is still the law, Blackwood. There's procedures for this sort of thing, civilizing influences, educational requirements, moral guidance." "I can read and write in 3 languages," Ayana interrupted. "Can you?" One of the hired guns snorted before he could stop himself. Dutch's face reddened. That's as may be, but there's ways these things should be done. Proper marriages, for instance, legal unions recognized by the territory. Otherwise, people talk, and when people talk, sometimes the law has to get involved. The threat hung in the air, clear as mountain water. Do it our way, on our terms, or we'll find reasons to cause trouble. Nate felt anger kindle in his chest, not the hot, quick rage of youth, but the cold fury of a man who'd seen too much injustice dressed up in righteous language. How long do we have to consider this advice? Oh, I'd say a week ought to do it. Give you time to ride to Tucson, see Judge Pierce, make things proper. Otherwise, Dutch shrugged. Can't say what might happen. Territorial authorities take a dim view of irregular situations. He touched his hat in mock courtesy and turned his horse. The hired guns followed. As they rode away, Ayanna stepped down from the cabin and came to stand beside Nate. He means to use me against you, she said quietly. He'll find some law, some regulation, some excuse. That's what men like him do. I know. You should send me away before they make trouble you don't deserve. Nate turned to look at her fully. In the morning light, with her face clean and her hair beginning to regain its luster, with food and rest softening the sharp edges of starvation, she was striking. But that wasn't what held his attention. It was the fierce intelligence in her eyes, the strength that imprisonment hadn't broken, the dignity that no amount of degradation had quite destroyed. You want to go? He asked. She held his gaze. No. Then we'll figure this out, together. That evening, as they sat by the fire inside the cabin now, the distance between them gradually shrinking over the days, Ayanna told them what Dutch's words really meant. Marriage as protection, as legal shield, the hypocrisy of men who'd caged her now demanding proper Christian union, the mockery of it all. He's right about one thing, Nate said after she'd finished. A legal marriage would make it harder for them to interfere. Wouldn't have to be real. Just a paper arrangement for the law's sake. You'd keep your freedom, your choices. But you'd have a legal name, legal standing. Make it harder for them to claim any authority over you. Ayanna was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of too many betrayals, too many false promises. And what would you want from this arrangement? Nothing beyond what we have now. Separate sleeping quarters, if that's what you prefer. Your own life. I'm not looking for a wife in anything but name, Ayanna. I'm just looking to keep the wolves from the door. She turned to face him, searching his weathered features in the firelight. Why do this for a stranger? For someone the whole town calls savage? Nate was silent for a moment, his hand unconsciously moving to the photograph on the mantel. A woman with kind eyes and a boy with his whole life ahead of him. Both dead 14 years now. Because 14 years ago, I couldn't save my own wife and daughter when diphtheria came through. Couldn't do anything but watch them die and bury them in ground too frozen to dig proper graves. I swore then that if I ever had the chance to help someone who needed it, I wouldn't let the moment pass. So here's the moment, here's the chance, and here's me asking if you'll accept it. The silence stretched between them, filled with the crackle of burning wood and the distant call of a night bird. Finally, Ayanna nodded. On one condition, she said. Name it. You teach me everything you know about living in these mountains. How to hunt, track, survive. How to be free the way you are. So if I ever have to run again, I'll know how. Nate extended his hand across the space between them. Deal. Ayanna took his hand. Her grip was firm, her palm calloused. And for the first time since he'd found her in that cage, she almost smiled. It was a small thing, fragile as new ice on a pond, but it was there. Outside, the first snow of autumn began to fall, soft and silent, covering the world in white. And in the darkness beyond the clearing, a man named Garrett Pike sat on his horse, watching the cabin through the trees, memorizing faces and making calculations about how much a woman like that might be worth to certain interested parties. 3 days before they were set to leave for Tucson, Nate took Tommy and Ayanna to the high ridge overlooking the valley. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of winter. Below them, Copper Ridge was a collection of gray buildings nestled against the foothills, small and insignificant from this height. First lesson, Nate said, kneeling to smooth the dirt in front of them. With a stick, he began drawing a rough map. We'll ride 3 days to Tucson. This is the route. 3 danger points where someone looking to cause trouble would wait. He marked them carefully. Eagle Pass, Narrow Canyon, easy to ambush. Dry Creek Crossing, no water for 12 hours after makes you vulnerable. And Saguaro Flats, open desert with nowhere to hide. Tommy studied the map with the intensity of youth trying to prove itself. How do we avoid them? We don't avoid them. We predict and prepare. Nate drew alternative routes around each point, but more important than where we go is how we think. Tommy, what's the first rule of staying alive in hostile territory? The boy thought for a moment. Trust your instincts? Close. Trust your horse's instincts. They smell what we can't, hear what we miss. If your mount gets nervous, there's a reason. Nate looked at Ayanna. Your people know this better than most whites. She nodded. My mother used to say the horse is your first guardian. The land is your second. Your weapon is only your third. Wise woman, Nate said quietly. They spent the morning going through scenarios. What to do if ambushed from high ground. How to read tracks to know how many riders were ahead. Where to make camp that offered both concealment and escape routes. Nate taught with patience, never raising his voice, turning each lesson into a story that would stick in memory. At one point, Tommy asked, Uncle Nate, have you ever had to shoot a man? The question hung in the thin mountain air. Ayanna watched Nate's face, saw something pass behind his eyes like a cloud crossing the sun. Yes, he said finally, more than I care to remember. The war with Mexico, skirmishes with Comanche raiders, claim jumpers who thought an isolated cabin would be easy pickings. He was quiet for a moment. Each time it took something from me. That's the truth they don't tell you about killing. It's not whether you can do it. It's whether you can live with having done it. Did you have a choice? Tommy pressed. Sometimes, sometimes not. The times I had a choice are the ones that wake me up at night. Nate stood, brushing dirt from his knees. That's why we try every other option first. Your gun is the last resort, not the first answer. Remember that. They rode back to the cabin in contemplative silence. But as they approached the clearing, Nate's hand went up in a signal to stop. The horses had gone tense beneath them. Someone's been here, he said quietly. The signs were subtle. A broken twig that shouldn't be broken. Boot prints too fresh to be from earlier that morning. The faint smell of tobacco smoke that didn't match Nate's pipe blend. Inside, Nate ordered. Tommy, rifle. Ayanna, stay away from the windows. They found the message nailed to the cabin door. A single piece of paper with crude lettering that read, 1 week, make it right or we make it wrong. Ayanna stared at it, her jaw tight. They're watching us. Have been for days, probably. Nate pulled the note down and studied the paper. This is from the general store. Means whoever wrote it bought it in Copper Ridge. Wants us to know they can come and go as they please. That night, Nate didn't sleep. He sat in the darkness by the window, rifle across his lap, watching the tree line. Tommy found him there just before dawn. You think they'll attack? The boy whispered. No, this was intimidation, not preparation for violence. They want us scared enough to either give in or make a mistake. Nate's eyes never left the forest. We're going to disappoint them on both counts. The next 2 days were spent preparing for the journey. Nate checked and rechecked their weapons, oiled the rifles, counted ammunition. He packed supplies with the precision of a man who'd learned that forgetting one item could mean the difference between survival and death. Dried meat, hardtack, coffee, medicine, extra blankets. Everything had its place in the saddlebags. Ayanna watched him work, learning the methodology. You've done this before. Traveled knowing people wanted you dead. More times than I'd like. Nate tested the tension on a cinch strap, during the war mostly, but also after when Hannah and I were homesteading. Raiders thought we'd be easy targets. We proved them wrong. Your wife, you loved her very much. It wasn't a question, but Nate answered anyway. More than I knew how to say. We met in Missouri, married in spring, headed west thinking we'd find our fortune in California. Found hardship instead, but we had each other. That was enough. Then we had Jacob, and the world made sense in a way it never had before. His hand stilled on the leather, Losing them felt like losing my reason for drawing breath. But you kept breathing anyway. Had to. My sister needed help. Sent me Tommy when he was 14. Boy needed raising. Gave me something to focus on besides the hole in my chest. He looked at her then. Really looked. Helping you? It's the first time in 14 years I've felt like I'm doing something that matters. Not just surviving. Living. Ayana's eyes shone in the lamplight. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it. Some things were too large for words yet. On the morning they were set to leave, an old woman appeared at the edge of the clearing. She came on foot, moving with the careful steps of someone whose bones had earned their aches. Her hair was white as winter clouds, her face carved by time into canyons and ridges. She wore a traditional Apache dress, and around her neck hung a medicine pouch decorated with turquoise and shell. Ayana gasped, "Grandmother Nalin." The old woman's face broke into a smile that erased decades. "Child of Morning Star, I have searched for you 9 winters." They embraced, and Ayana wept. Real tears, not the dry-eyed grief of someone who'd learned that crying changed nothing. These were tears of recognition, of connection to a past she'd thought burned to ash. Nate and Tommy stood back, giving them space. After a time, Grandmother Nayland turned to study Nate with eyes that seemed to see straight through to bone. "You are the mountain man who bought her freedom." "Yes, ma'am." "You knew her father." "I did. Miguel Alvarez saved my life once. I promised to look after his family if anything happened to him." Nalin nodded slowly. "The spirit sent you at the right time. I have something that belongs to the daughter of Miguel." She reached into the leather bag she carried and withdrew a journal, its cover worn soft with age and handling. Ayana took it with trembling hands. "This is Father's writing. He gave it to me the day before the soldiers came. Said if he died, you should have it. I hid it all these years, waiting for the day I would find you." Nalin's voice grew heavy. "I am old now. The waiting is over." They sat in the cabin while Ayana opened the journal. Nate had to read some of it aloud as Miguel's handwriting was small and faded in places, mixing Spanish and English in the way of educated men comfortable in both languages. The entries chronicled years of investigation. Miguel had been methodical, documenting every instance of fraud by the Copper Baron Mining Company, forged signatures on land deeds, mineral rights claimed through intimidation and violence, government officials bribed to look the other way. And at the center of it all, a name, Victor Drummond Kane, owner and operator of Copper Baron, a man who'd built an empire on stolen land and broken laws. But the entry that made Ayana's hand shake was dated March 28, 1869. Received direct threat from Kane's agent today. They know I plan to present evidence to Washington. The agent said, drop the investigation or face consequences. I will not drop it. Tomorrow I take my family to the safe house in the mountains. But tonight I write this entry in case I do not survive. Kane has paid Colonel Harrison Webb $10,000 to clear Apache settlements from land the company wants. My family's hacienda sits on that land. If anything happens to us, it is murder dressed as military action, and Kane and Webb are the architects. Tommy's voice broke the silence. He knew they were coming for him. Ayana's face had gone pale. Colonel Harrison Webb, I remember that name. I heard it the night they attacked. A man with a red beard and a scar on his neck. He gave the orders. Burn everything. Leave no one alive. Nate's jaw clenched. Harrison Webb is a general now, stationed at Fort Huachuca. He's got political connections all the way to Washington. Then he is beyond justice, Ayana said, her voice flat. No one is beyond justice, just beyond easy justice. Nate turned pages carefully. There's more here. Look at this. Near the back of the journal, tucked into the binding, was a telegram. Yellowed and creased, dated 1872. The message was brief. M.A. alive, Santa Fe, critical condition. Grandmother Nayland leaned forward. 3 years after the attack, this came to the mission where I was hiding. The priest brought it to me. He said a man matching Miguel's description was in a hospital in Santa Fe, recovering from gunshot wounds. My father lived? Ayana's voice was barely a whisper. For a time, the priest made inquiries. Miguel survived until 1873, but he never recovered. The wounds were too severe. Before he died, he wrote a letter. I have kept it safe. The letter was in an envelope sealed with wax. Ayana's name was written across the front in a shaking hand. She broke the seal with careful fingers and unfolded the pages within. Nate watched her face as she read, saw the play of emotions crossing it like weather over the mountains. Pain, love, grief, and finally something like peace. When she finished, she read portions aloud, translating from the Spanish. My dearest Ayana, if you read this, I have failed to protect you as a father should. I leave tomorrow to present evidence to the territorial governor. I fear I may not return. Know that everything I have done, every risk I have taken, has been in hope of creating a world where you can live freely, where your mixed heritage is celebrated rather than scorned, where justice means something real. I have left instructions with my attorney. All my property is held in trust for you. Use it wisely, my daughter. Use it to build something better than what I leave behind. Her voice broke. He signed it. Your father who loves you beyond death itself. Tommy wiped his eyes without shame. Nate stood and walked to the window, his back to them, his shoulders tight with emotion he didn't quite know how to express. Grandmother Nolan spoke into the silence. There is more you should know. Miguel owned land, much land, 15,000 acres in the Chiricahua Valley, purchased legally in 1867 and 1868. It was to be your inheritance, a place where both sides of your blood would live in peace. The Copper Baron Mining Company had been operating on that land for 10 years, claiming ownership through forged documents. Ayana looked up sharply. They're stealing from land that belongs to me? If we can prove you are Miguel's daughter, yes. The land is yours by right. Their entire operation would be void. Nate turned back from the window. Then we don't just go to Tucson to get a marriage certificate for protection. We go to reclaim what's hers and bring down the people who murdered her family. The weight of it settled over them. This was no longer just about one woman's freedom. It was about exposing a decade of corruption and violence. It was about justice for everyone the Copper Baron Mining Company had destroyed. They'll fight this, Tommy said, with everything they have. Yes, Nate agreed, which is why we need to be smarter than they are, and we need help. The journey to Tucson began the next morning. They rode carefully, Nate and Tommy in front, Ayana between them, Grandmother Nayland on a gentle mare Nate kept for pack work. The old woman insisted on coming, said her testimony about Miguel would be crucial. They'd gone perhaps 10 miles when Nate raised his hand for silence. The horses had gone nervous, ears back, nostrils flaring. Riders ahead, he murmured. In the trees. How many? Tommy whispered. Oh, can't tell yet, but they're not trying very hard to hide. They rounded a bend and found 4 men blocking the trail. Not hired guns, not cavalry. These were weathered men in their 50s, carrying rifles but not pointing them. The one in front, lean and sun-dark with a gray beard, broke into a smile. Nate Blackwood, I'll be damned. Nate's posture relaxed slightly. Jake Morrison, thought you went back east. Did, came back. Turns out I'm not suited for city living. Jake's eyes moved to Ayana. Heard you bought someone out of that cage in Copper Ridge. Heard you were headed to Tucson with her. We came to make sure you got there in one piece. We? Me and the boys here. All served with your friend Miguel back in the day. Figured if his daughter needs help, we owe him that much. One of the other men spoke up. Miguel Alvarez kept us from being court-martialed when our captain tried to make us murder civilians. He went over that captain's head straight to the territorial governor. Saved our careers and our consciences. We don't forget debts like that. Nate studied them while I'm measuring. These were good men, the kind you wanted at your back when the trouble came calling. Appreciated. Can always use extra eyes. Their group doubled to 8. With Jake and his men riding scout and rear guard, they made better time and felt considerably safer. Around the campfire that first night, Jake told stories of Miguel that made Ayana smile through her tears. Your father had this way about him, could talk a rattlesnake into giving up its venom. I saw him negotiate a truce between Apache and settlers when both sides wanted blood. He sat in the middle of a field for 6 hours, alone, talking to representatives from each group. By sunset, they'd agreed to share water rights and grazing land. Nobody else could have done it. Ayana listened hungrily to every detail. rebuilding the father she'd lost from the memories of men who'd served with him. Nate watched her across the firelight, saw how the grief had started to transform into something else. Not forgetting, but honoring. The difference mattered. The second day brought them to Dry Creek Crossing. True to its name, the creek bed was bone dry, nothing but white stones and dust. The sun beat down merciless, and the temperature climbed past 100 degrees. They'd planned for this, filling extra canteens before leaving the last water source. But Tommy's horse went lame a mile from the crossing, a stone bruise that made her favor her right foreleg. They had to slow down, stop more often, and by late afternoon they were rationing water more carefully than Nate liked. Ayanna studied the dry landscape with narrowed eyes. Then she dismounted and began examining the plant life, such as it was. Scrub brush mostly, and some small cottonwoods that looked half dead. "What are you doing?" Tommy asked. "Watching what my mother taught me." She knelt by one of the cottonwoods, studying its roots. "These trees don't die completely because there's water underground. See how the roots run? They're all angling that direction. If we dig there, we might find moisture." Jake looked skeptical. "Might is a long word in the desert, miss." "So is thirst." She walked 30 yards in the direction the roots indicated and found a low spot where the ground was slightly darker. "Here, if anywhere." They dug. 2 feet down, the soil was damp. 3 feet down, water began to seep into the hole. It wasn't much, barely enough to fill a canteen, but it was something. They took turns digging similar holes, creating a small network of water sources that slowly filled. By sunset, they'd replenished their supply and given the horses a much-needed drink. Jake raised his canteen to Ayanna in salute. "Your mother taught you well. She taught me how to survive when everyone else said my people were savages who knew nothing." There was no bitterness in Ayanna's voice, just statement of fact. Turns out, knowing how to find water in a desert is pretty civilized. They reached Tucson on the afternoon of the third day. The town was larger than Copper Ridge by an order of magnitude, perhaps 2,000 souls, with actual streets and gas lamps in buildings made of adobe and stone, rather than rough timber. The courthouse stood at the center of town, a 2-story structure that represented law and order in a territory still finding its way towards civilization. Judge Horatio Thaddeus Pierce kept offices on the second floor. He was 65 years old, with silver hair swept back from a high forehead and sharp blue eyes that missed little. When his clerk showed Nate and Ayanna into his chambers, Pierce was reading case files, but he looked up and recognition crossed his face. "Nate Blackwood. It's been, what, 15 years? About that, Your Honor. I need your help with a legal matter." "I assumed it wasn't a social call." Pierce's gaze moved to Ayanna. "And you are?" She stood straight, meeting his eyes without flinching. "Ayanna White Deer Alvarez, daughter of Judge Miguel Cristobal Alvarez." The silence that followed was profound. Pierce set down his papers very carefully. "Miguel Alvarez's daughter. We were told you died in the massacre of 1869. "I survived. Barely. I've spent 9 years trying to stay alive. Now I'm here to claim what's mine and bring justice for what was taken." Pierce stood, walked to his window, looked out over Tucson. When he spoke, his voice was heavy. "Your father was one of the finest men I've ever known. His death, if we can call it that, given the uncertainty, was a blow to justice in this territory. If you're truly his daughter, I'll do everything in my power to help you, but I'll need proof." Over the next hour, they presented everything. Grandmother Nolan's testimony, the journal, the telegram, Ayanna's own memories, specific enough that only Miguel's daughter could know them. Details about the hacienda, about Miguel's habits, about the books he'd read to her in 3 languages. Pierce listened, asked questions, took notes. Finally, he sat back in his chair. "I believe you, but belief isn't enough for a court of law. We'll need to build an ironclad case, and I know just the man to help us do it." He sent his clerk to fetch attorney Jacob Fisher. Fisher arrived within the hour, a compact man in his late 40s with wire-rimmed spectacles and ink-stained fingers. He was German by birth, American by choice, and passionate about justice in the way only immigrants who'd fled tyranny could be. When he read Miguel's journal, his eyes went wide. "This is, how do you say, dynamite. This evidence could bring down not just copper baron mining, but half the territorial government. Men in very high places will not want this seen, which is exactly why it needs to be seen, Ayanna said. Fisher looked at her with something like awe. You are very brave, Miss Alvarez, or very foolish. Perhaps both, which is the best combination for changing the world. He turned to Pierce. We'll need to move fast. Once they know what we're planning, they'll try to stop us by any means necessary. How fast? Nate asked. I can file the initial paperwork tomorrow. Petition to establish Ayanna as legal heir, challenge to all copper baron land claims, request for investigation into the 1869 massacre. But here's the problem. The moment those documents are filed, they become public record. Anyone can see them, and the people named in them will know we're coming. How long until trial? 60 days, maybe 90. Territorial courts move slowly. When Fisher removed his spectacles, cleaned them. 60 days is a long time to stay alive when powerful men want you dead. Pierce spoke up. She can stay at my house. It's behind walls, with guards I trust. Safer than a hotel. Nate shook his head. Respectfully, Your Honor, I'm not leaving her protection to anyone else. Tommy and I will stay with her wherever she goes. And us, Jake Morrison said from the doorway. He'd been standing there listening. We didn't ride 3 days to abandon her in the final mile. Pierce looked at the assembled group and nodded slowly. Very well. My house can accommodate all of you. We'll turn it into a fortress if we have to. But understand this. Once we file these papers, there's no going back. The Copper Baron Mining Company will throw everything they have at us. Legal challenges, intimidation, possibly violence. Are you prepared for that? Ayanna stood. My father died investigating these men. My mother and brother were murdered because of their greed. I've spent 7 months in a cage because people like them profit from cruelty. I'm not just prepared, Your Honor. I'm ready. Fisher smiled. Then tomorrow we go to war. A legal war, but war nonetheless. That night, in the room Pierce's housekeeper had prepared for her, Ayanna stood at the window looking out over Tucson. The town glittered with lamplight, more light than she'd seen in years. Somewhere out there were the men responsible for destroying her family. Soon they would know she was coming for them. A knock at the door, Nate's voice. You should sleep. Tomorrow will be hard. She opened the door. He stood in the hallway, still dressed, a rifle slung over his shoulder. You're standing guard. Can't be too careful. Come in, just for a moment. He hesitated, then stepped inside, leaving the door open for propriety's sake. Ayanna gestured to the chairs by the fireplace. They sat in silence for a while, comfortable with the quiet. Finally, she spoke. Why are you really doing this, Nate? You paid the debt to my father when you bought me out of that cage. You could go back to your mountain tomorrow and never look back. Why stay? Nate was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was low and raw. When Hannah and Jacob died, I died with them. Not physically, but inside, where it matters. I went to the mountains because I couldn't stand to be around people anymore. Couldn't stand to see families together, children playing, couples growing old. It reminded me of everything I'd lost. So I hid. Told myself I was living, but I was just breathing, just waiting for the end. He looked at her then, really looked. You gave me something I thought was gone forever. Purpose, the chance to make a difference, to fight for something that matters. Helping you isn't about debt anymore, Ayanna. It's about remembering what it feels like to be alive. She reached across the space between them and took his hand. Her palm was warm, her grip strong. Then we'll fight together, and maybe we'll both remember what it means to live. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of creosote and dust. And in an office across town, a telegraph operator transcribed a message for immediate delivery to Copper Ridge. Alvarez daughter in Tucson with Blackwood. Filing legal action tomorrow. Recommend immediate intervention. Stop them before they reach courthouse. The message was signed with a simple K and would be delivered to Victor's Drummond Kane before midnight. The machinery of violence was already beginning to turn. The morning came too fast and too bright. Nate woke from his post in the hallway outside Ayanna's room to find Tommy already awake, cleaning his rifle with the methodical care Nate had taught him. Couldn't sleep? Nate asked. Kept thinking about what happens if they try to stop us before we reach the courthouse. Tommy looked up, and there was something older in his eyes than there had been a month ago. Uncle Nate, are we going to have to kill people today? I hope not, but hope doesn't stop bullets. Nate stood, joints protesting. 58 years had a way of making themselves known in the morning. Remember what I told you? The gun is the last resort. We try every other option first. But if it comes down to them or us, you don't hesitate. Hesitation gets good people killed. They gathered in Pierce's dining room for a breakfast that no one had much appetite for. Ayanna wore a simple black dress that Pierce's housekeeper had altered to fit her. Her hair was pulled back severe, and she wore no jewelry except a silver necklace with a small turquoise stone that had belonged to her mother. She looked every inch a proper lady of society, which was exactly the point. The courtroom was a theater, and appearance mattered. Fisher arrived at 7 with a leather satchel full of documents. I worked through the night preparing the filings. Everything is in order. We have 3 primary petitions. First, to establish Ayanna's identity as Miguel Alvarez's legitimate heir. Second, to challenge all land transfers made by copper baron mining since 1869. Third, to request a criminal investigation into the massacre and the bribery of government officials. How will they respond? Jake Morrison asked. He and his men had spent the night positioned around Pierce's house, watching for trouble that mercifully hadn't come. Legally, they'll file immediate motions to dismiss. They'll argue lack of standing, insufficient evidence, statute of limitations, standard tactics to delay and obfuscate. Fisher adjusted his spectacles. But I'm more concerned with what they'll do outside the law. As if summoning the very thing they feared, a commotion erupted from the street. Shouts, the sound of running feet. Pierce's guard burst through the door, breathing hard. Your Honor, there's a group of armed men forming up 2 blocks from here. Maybe 20 of them. They're asking about the Apache woman. Nate was at the window in 3 strides. Through the glass, he could see them. Not soldiers, not lawmen. Hired guns, the kind that drifted from town to town selling violence to the highest bidder. They were checking weapons, passing a bottle, working up their courage. Front and back? He asked. Just front, so far, but more could be coming. Then we go out the back. Now. Nate turned to the room. Jake, you and your men lead. Tommy and I will bring up the rear with Ayanna in the middle. Judge Pierce, you and Fisher go separately. If they're watching for a group, splitting up gives us better odds. They move fast. Out through Pierce's kitchen, through the garden, over the back wall, into an alley that ran between properties. Jake and his men had scouted escape routes the night before, and they used that knowledge now, moving through Tucson's back ways like smoke through cracks. They were 3 blocks from the courthouse when the first shot rang out. It came from a rooftop. The crack of a rifle followed immediately by the whine of a bullet passing close enough that Nate felt the air move. Everyone scattered, diving for cover behind water troughs and porch supports. Sniper, Jake called unnecessarily. Northeast roof, maybe 70 yards. Tommy had his rifle up and fired back. The sniper ducked. It wasn't a killing shot, but it bought them time. They ran, zigzagging, using every piece of cover available. More shots followed, kicking up dust and splintering wood. But they were moving targets now and harder to hit. They burst onto the courthouse square from an unexpected angle. The building rose before them, solid and imposing, representing law and order in a territory that often had precious little of either. The steps leading up to the entrance were broad and steep, designed to make anyone approaching feel small and judged. Waiting at the top was another group of armed men. Not as many as before, only 6, but they were positioned well and armed with rifles. At their center stood a man Nate had never seen, but recognized instantly from description. Victor Drummond Kane, owner of Copper Baron Mining, architect of a decade of theft and violence, dressed in an expensive suit that made him look like a businessman rather than the criminal he was. Miss Alvarez, Kane called down, his voice carrying that particular blend of educated speech and absolute certainty in his own authority. I believe we should talk before you make a terrible mistake. Ayanna stepped forward before Nate could stop her. The only mistake was yours, Mr. Kane, thinking you could murder my family and steal our land without consequence. Murder? Kane smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. Such dramatic language. Your family died in a military action against hostile Apache. Tragic, certainly, but legal. As for the land, Copper Baron Mining has owned it legally since 1870. Through forged documents and bribes. Ayana's voice rang clear across the square. People were gathering now, drawn by the commotion. A crowd was forming, which was both dangerous and useful. Witnesses could protect them or get them killed, depending on which way sentiment ran. Kane descended 3 steps, his men following. I'm a reasonable man, Miss Alvarez. I'll offer you $100,000 to walk away. Enough money to live comfortably for the rest of your life. All you have to do is renounce these false claims and leave Arizona territory. I'm not leaving, and my claims aren't false. Then you're a fool, and fools die young in this territory. Kane's smile vanished. Last chance. Take the money or face the consequences. Nate stepped up beside Ayana, Tommy on her other side. Jake and his men formed a loose semicircle behind them. The message was clear. She wasn't alone. She's not interested in your blood money, Nate said quietly. Step aside and let us pass. And who exactly are you, some mountain man playing hero? Kane's eyes were cold, calculating. I know all about you, Nathaniel Blackwood. You bought this woman like you'd buy a horse. What's your angle? Planning to marry her and claim the land yourself? My angle is keeping a promise to a good man who saved my life. Something you wouldn't understand. The tension stretched tight at his bowstring. Kane's men shifted, hands moving toward weapons. Jake's men responded in kind. One spark would light a powder keg that would kill a dozen people in the next 30 seconds. The spark was prevented by an unexpected source. From the courthouse doors emerged Judge Lawrence Whitman, the territorial judge who would be hearing the case. He was 68 with a presence that commanded attention despite his modest height. His voice boomed across the square. Mr. Kane, stand down immediately, or I'll hold you in contempt before we even begin proceedings. Kane's jaw clenched. But Whitman was the law here, and even Kane couldn't simply ignore a direct order from a territorial judge. Not with this many witnesses. This isn't over, Kane said quietly, meant only for Ayana's ears. Then louder, we'll settle this in court, Your Honor, as civilized people should. He turned and walked away, his men following, but the threat in his eyes promised that courtrooms weren't the only battlefield he intended to use. The courtroom was packed. Word had spread through Tucson faster than wildfire, and everyone wanted to see the case that had nearly sparked a gunfight in broad daylight. Journalists from Tucson, Phoenix, and Santa Fe crowded the press benches, pencils ready. The gallery was filled with miners, ranchers, townspeople, and the simply curious. Ayana sat at the plaintiff's table with Fisher beside her. Behind them, Nate, Tommy, and grandmother Nolan formed a wall of support. Across the aisle, Kane sat with a battery of lawyers, 10 men in expensive suits, who collectively represented more legal firepower than most people would see in a lifetime. Judge Whitman entered, and everyone rose. The bailiff called the court to order. The machinery of justice began to turn. Fisher stood for his opening statement. Your Honor, members of the court, what we present today is a case that goes beyond mere property disputes. This is about systematic corruption, about murder disguised as military action, about a decade of theft perpetrated by powerful men who believe themselves above the law. Miss Ayana Alvarez sits before you as living proof that their conspiracy can be exposed. Her father, Judge Miguel Cristobal Alvarez, was murdered for investigating the very crimes we now seek to prosecute. We will prove beyond doubt that Miss Alvarez is his legitimate heir, that her family was targeted for elimination, and that the Copper Baron Mining Company has operated on stolen land for 10 years. Stanford Grayson, lead counsel for Copper Baron, rose for the defense. He was 55, silver-haired, with the practiced charm of a man who'd won more cases through personality than precedent. Your Honor, what we have here is an elaborate fiction constructed by opportunists seeking to defraud my client. This woman claims to be the daughter of a respected judge, yet she has no documentation, no proof beyond the testimony of biased witnesses in a journal that could have been forged. The tragedy of 1869 was real, but it was a military action against Apache insurgents, not the massacre this fiction portrays. My client has operated legally and transparently for a decade. We will prove that these accusations are baseless. The first 2 days of trial established the foundation. Grandmother Nayland testified with unshakable dignity, her testimony surviving Grayson's aggressive cross-examination. Professor Edmund Hartley's handwriting analysis confirmed the journal's authenticity beyond doubt. Each witness added another brick to the wall of evidence, and the jury paid close attention. But the real turning point came when Ayanna took the stand. Fisher guided her through her testimony with gentle questions. She told her story simply, without embellishment, her childhood learning 3 languages from her father, her mother teaching her Apache traditions and Spanish songs, the night of the attack, hiding in the cellar while her family was murdered. The 9 years that followed. Odindai's found them, years of running and surviving, and eventually being caged like an animal. Miss Alvarez, Fisher said, do you see the man who ordered the attack on your family in this courtroom? No, Colonel Harrison Webb is not here, but I remember him. Red beard, scar on his neck, voice like a snake. He gave the order to burn our home and kill everyone. Grayson's cross-examination was aggressive. Miss Alvarez, you claim to remember details from 9 years ago. When you were, what, 17? How can we trust the memories of a traumatized child? Because some things burn into your memory and never fade. Her voice was steady. I remember my brother's face when he died. I remember my mother's last words. I remember the smell of our home burning. Those aren't things you forget, Mr. Grayson. Those are things that define the rest of your life. The courtroom was silent. Even Grayson seemed to realize he'd miscalculated. Fisher introduced Miguel's journal into evidence. He read key passages aloud, including the entry that detailed Kane's payment to Webb for the military action. The entries about forged land documents, the names of bribed officials. It was damning, comprehensive, and impossible to dismiss. When court adjourned for the day, Whitman's expressions suggested which way he was leaning. But he was a thorough man, committed to due process. We'll reconvene tomorrow at 9. The defense will present their case. Everyone is reminded that witness intimidation will not be tolerated. They returned to Pierce's house under guard, U.S. Marshals having been assigned to ensure their safety after the morning's confrontation. But Nate couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Kane had been too quiet during the proceedings, too confident despite the evidence mounting against him. His instincts proved correct just after midnight. Nate was dozing in a chair by Ayanna's door when he heard it. The soft scrape of a window opening somewhere in the house. He was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, moving silent as smoke through the dark hallways. He found the intruder in Pierce's study, a man dressed in black, rifling through the judge's papers. Looking for what, Nate couldn't guess, but the knife on the man's belt suggested his intentions weren't limited to burglary. Nate didn't announce himself. He simply cocked the rifle, the sound unmistakable in the quiet room. The intruder froze. Turn around slow, Nate said. Hands where I can see them. The man turned. He was in his 30s, lean and dangerous looking, with the dead eyes of someone who'd killed before and would again without hesitation. You're making a mistake, old man. Not the first time, won't be the last. Who sent you? Nobody you can touch. Try me. The intruder's hand moved toward his knife. Nate fired, not to kill, but to stop. The bullet took the man in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the floor. The noise brought everyone running. Marshals, Jake's men, Tommy with his own rifle ready. They bound the intruder and called for a doctor. While they waited, the man, whether from pain or fear of what Kane would do to him for failure, started talking. Webb sent me. General Harrison Webb. He said stop the trial by any means necessary. Kill the judge, kill the woman, burn the evidence, whatever it took. Marshal Davidson, who'd been assigned to coordinate their security, went pale. Webb is directly involved? That's conspiracy at the highest level. An attempted murder of a territorial judge, Pierce added. He looked shaken but resolute. This changes everything. We're not just fighting a mining company anymore. We're fighting elements of the military establishment. At dawn, Fisher and Pierce filed emergency motions with Judge Whitman, presenting the intruder's confession and requesting immediate subpoenas for General Webb. By noon, federal marshals were riding toward Fort Huachuca with arrest warrants. But Webb didn't wait to be arrested. He came to them. The second day of the trial had barely begun when the courtroom doors burst open. General Harrison Webb strode in, flanked by a squad of soldiers in full uniform. He was 54, still imposing despite the gray in his red beard, wearing his rank-like armor. "Your Honor," Webb announced without preamble, "I'm here to set the record straight before this travesty of a trial goes any further." Whitman's face went thunderous. "General Webb, you are out of order. This is a court of law, not a military installation. And I'm a general in the United States Army. I don't take orders from territorial judges." Webb's eyes swept the courtroom and landed on Ayanna. "As for you, your accusations are slander. The action in 1869 was a legitimate military operation against Apache insurgents who were harboring criminals." Ayanna stood, her voice ringing out. "My family wasn't harboring anyone. We were living peacefully on our own land. You murdered us because Victor Kane paid you to clear us out." "I took no bribes. I followed orders from my superiors." "Orders don't excuse murder." The courtroom erupted. Whitman hammered his gavel. "Order! I will have order!" When the noise subsided, he turned to Webb. "General, you are not above civilian law. If you wish to testify, you'll do so under oath like anyone else." Webb's jaw clenched. For a moment, it seemed he might refuse, might simply walk out and dare anyone to stop him. But then something in his expression shifted. Perhaps he realized that running would be an admission of guilt. Perhaps he thought he could talk his way out of this. "Fine, I'll testify under oath, and I'll tell the truth about what really happened." What followed was 3 hours of testimony that swung between defense and incrimination. Webb maintained that the 1869 action was legitimate, ordered by his superiors based on intelligence about Apache raiders. But under Fisher's cross-examination, cracks began to appear. "General Webb, did you receive $10,000 from Victor Kane in March of 1869? "I received a donation to the Military Widows Fund. The bank records show the money went to your personal account. I intended to transfer it. I never got around to it." "How convenient. And this donation came exactly 1 week before you led the raid on Judge Alvarez's property?" "Coincidence. Quite a coincidence, and another coincidence that Judge Alvarez was investigating Mr. Kane for fraud at the exact same time." Webb's face was turning red. "I don't know what Alvarez was investigating. I followed military orders." Fisher produced a document. "This is a telegram from your commanding officer dated April 10th, 1869, 3 days before the raid. It explicitly states that there is no intelligence suggesting hostile Apache activity in the Copper Ridge area. It advises against any military action without further confirmation. You proceeded anyway." "Why?" The silence stretched. Webb's hands gripped the arms of his chair so hard his knuckles went white. Finally he spoke, and his voice was different. Not angry, not defensive. Tired. "Because Kane told me Alvarez was going to destroy everything I'd worked for. He said if the investigation went forward, my career was over. My reputation was over. I'd end my service in disgrace. I did what I thought I had to do to protect myself." The courtroom gasped. It was an admission, not a full confession, but close enough. Whitman leaned forward. "General Webb, are you saying you conducted an unauthorized military action against American citizens for personal gain?" Webb seemed to age 10 years in that moment. "I'm saying I made a mistake, a terrible mistake, and I've lived with it every day since." It was the crack in the dam. Once Webb's testimony established the illegitimacy of the military action, the rest of Kane's defense crumbled. Over the next 2 days, Fisher systematically proved that every land transfer, every mineral rights claim, every document Copper Baron had used to justify their operations was based on fraud. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood to read the verdict. "In the matter of Ayanna Alvarez versus Copper Baron Mining Company, we find for the plaintiff. We determine that Miss Alvarez is the legitimate heir of Judge Miguel Alvarez and rightful owner of all property held in his name. We further determine that all land transfers by Copper Baron Mining since 1869 are void, being based on fraudulent documents and illegal seizure. We recommend criminal investigation into Victor Kane and Harrison Webb for conspiracy, fraud, and murder." Whitman nodded gravely. "The jury's verdict is accepted. Furthermore, I'm ordering the immediate arrest of Victor Kane and General Harrison Webb on criminal charges. Copper Baron Mining Company's assets are frozen pending restitution proceedings. Miss Alvarez, this court recognizes your ownership of 15,000 acres in Chiricahua Valley. Justice, though delayed, has finally arrived. The courtroom erupted in cheers and shouting. Ayanna stood motionless, tears streaming down her face. Nate put his hand on her shoulder, and she turned to him, burying her face against his chest and sobbing. Not from grief this time, from relief, from vindication, from the crushing weight of 9 years finally lifting. But justice, Nate knew, wasn't finished yet. Kane tried to run. He made it as far as the courthouse steps before U.S. Marshals tackled him. Webb surrendered quietly, his military bearing finally broken. Both were taken into custody to await criminal trial. The criminal trials that followed made national news. 3 months of proceedings laid bare a decade of corruption reaching into the highest levels of territorial government. Kane received 25 years in territorial prison for conspiracy, fraud, and accessory to murder. Webb, stripped of his rank and military pension, received 20 years. 2 territorial senators implicated in the bribery scheme resigned in disgrace. The Copper Baron Mining Company was dissolved, its remaining assets liquidated to pay restitution to victims across Arizona territory. Justice, Ayanna learned, was slow but thorough, and when it finally arrived, it arrived with weight. That evening, as the sun set over Tucson, Nate and Ayanna stood on the balcony of Pierce's house. Tommy was inside with Jake and the others, celebrating with whiskey and stories. Grandmother Nayland was resting, exhausted by the ordeal but peaceful. "What happens now?" Ayanna asked. "Now you decide. The land is yours, 15,000 acres. You could sell it, keep it, do whatever you want." She was quiet for a long time. "I want to create something my father would be proud of. A trust, maybe. Give part of the land to Apache families who've been displaced, part to homesteaders who need a fresh start. Keep some as protected wilderness." She looked at him. "I want to build something that lasts, something that honors both sides of my heritage." "That's good thinking. That's exactly what Miguel would have wanted. And you, Nate, what do you want?" He smiled, and it reached his eyes for the first time in a long time. "Right now, I want to take you back to the mountains. Show you how to track elk in fresh snow. Teach you to read stars well enough to navigate by them. Maybe build an addition onto the cabin if you're planning on staying." "Are you asking me to stay?" "I'm asking you to think about it. This started as me paying a debt to your father. Then it became about justice. But somewhere along the way, it became about something else." He took her hand. "You made me remember what it feels like to have a purpose, to care about tomorrow instead of just surviving today. I'd like to see where that goes, if you would." She squeezed his hand. "I'd like that too." 6 months later, in the spring of 1879, a new school opened in what was now called Alvarez Springs, formerly Copper Ridge. The bell that called children to class had been cast from the iron bars of the cage that once held a woman the town had called Savage. At the dedication ceremony, Ayanna stood before the assembled townspeople. Many were the same people who'd walked past her cage without a second thought. To their credit, many had the grace to look ashamed. "My father believed that education was the path to justice," she said. "That knowledge was the great equalizer. This school is open to all children, regardless of race or family wealth. It's named for Miguel Alvarez, but it's dedicated to the idea that we can be better than we have been, that we can choose compassion over cruelty, that we can build something good from the ruins of something terrible." She rang the bell for the first time. The sound carried across the valley clear and bright and full of promise. Nate stood beside Tommy, watching. The boy was 17 now, preparing to head to Tucson to study law under Fisher's mentorship. He'd grown 3 inches and gained the kind of confidence that comes from facing hard things and not breaking. "Uncle Nate," Tommy said, "do you think it's really over? All of it?" "The legal part, maybe. Kane and Webb are going to prison. The company is dissolved. But changing hearts, that's longer work. That's generation work." He put his hand on Tommy's shoulder. "But it's work worth doing. Your Aunt Hannah used to say that justice isn't a destination. It's a direction. You keep walking toward it, even when the path is hard." I miss them, Aunt Hannah and Jacob, even though I never met them. I know, son, but they'd be proud of you. I'm proud of you. The next morning before Tommy left for Tucson with his belongings packed on a mule, he found Nate by the creek behind the cabin. The old mountain man was checking his traps, the same routine he'd followed for 20 years. Uncle Nate, Tommy began, his voice thick. I need to say something before I go. Nate straightened, wiped his hands on his buckskins. I'm listening. When Ma died and you took me in, I was angry. Angry at the world, angry at God, angry at you for making me leave everything I knew. Tommy's eyes were bright. But you didn't just give me a place to live. You taught me what it means to be a man. Not through words, but through example. You showed me that strength isn't about dominance. It's about keeping your word even when it costs you everything. It's about standing up for people who can't stand up for themselves. Nate's throat tightened. You learned those lessons on your own, son. I just gave you a place to watch. No, Tommy shook his head. You gave me more than that. You gave me a code to live by, and I'm going to spend my life living up to it, fighting for people like Miss Ayana, making sure no one else gets put in a cage while good people look away. Nate pulled the boy into a rough embrace. Your Aunt Hannah would be proud. Jacob would be proud. His voice cracked slightly. I couldn't save them. But watching you become the man you are, it's like getting a piece of them back. When they finally pulled apart, both had tears on their faces and no shame about it. Write to me, Nate said. Let me know how the studying goes. Every week, Tommy promised. And Uncle Nate, thank you for everything. Nate watched him ride away toward Tucson, toward law school, toward a future bright with purpose. The scared 14-year-old who'd arrived at the cabin 3 years ago was gone completely, replaced by a young man who knew exactly who he was and what he stood for. Hannah would have loved him, Nate thought. Jacob would have looked up to him. And that, more than anything else in this long and complicated life, made everything worthwhile. The school bell rang again, and children began filing in. Apache children and white children, Mexican children and children of mixed heritage, all of them walking through doors that had been forged from a cage. In the cemetery on the hill overlooking the valley, 3 headstones stood in a row. Miguel Cristobal Alvarez, Morning Star, Diego Alvarez, finally together, finally at rest. Ayana visited them every week, sometimes with Nate, sometimes alone. She told them about the school, about the land trust, about the changes happening in the valley that bore their name. And sometimes when the wind was right, she swore she could hear her father's voice, not in words, but in the feeling that settled over her like sunlight, the feeling that said she'd done well, that he was proud, that love never really dies, it just changes form. Nate and Ayana married that summer in a ceremony that blended Apache traditions with Christian rites. Reverend Moss officiated, Jake Morrison stood as best man, and Grandmother Nolan blessed the union in the old language. The whole valley came to celebrate. Even old Toby, who'd ridden 2 days from his new smithy in Phoenix just to be there. They returned to the cabin in the mountains, but they spent half their time in the valley, helping build the community that Ayana envisioned. She was tireless, meeting with families who needed land, negotiating water rights, mediating disputes. People came to respect her not because of what she'd survived, but because of what she built. Years later, when Reverend Moss was an old man telling stories to his grandson, he would say this, Nate Blackwood taught me that strength isn't about dominance. It's about knowing when to stand firm and when to yield, about protecting without controlling, about having the courage to honor your word, even when it costs you everything. And Ayana Alvarez taught me that justice delayed isn't justice denied, if someone has the courage to keep fighting for it. Together, they showed a whole valley that redemption is possible, that we can face the worst parts of ourselves and choose to be better. He paused, looking out the window of the home where he'd spend his final days. That's the story, Daniel. Not the gunfights or the courtroom drama, though those make for good telling. The real story is about 2 broken people who found healing in each other, about a promise kept across 22 years, about choosing compassion when cruelty would be easier. That's what makes a legend worth remembering. The bell at Miguel Alvarez School rang out across the valley, calling another generation of children to learn. And in the mountains above, smoke rose from a cabin chimney where a mountain man and a woman who'd once been caged sat together, watching the sun set over land that finally belonged to the people who loved it. The iron cage had become a bell, the suffering had become hope, and two people who'd lost everything had found, in each other, a reason to believe in tomorrow. That was justice, not perfect, but real, not immediate, but inevitable. The kind that changes not just laws, but hearts. And that was enough.